What's up, everybody? This is going to be episode 54 or 55. We'll find out in the near future, featuring the amazing and the talented writer, Fabian Gorsler. I think I'm saying that correctly, who is joining us on today's episode. An Untold Narrative is a podcast where we feature unknown creatives who don't have a massive following but are doing extraordinary things amongst their own industries and their creative fields. So we are stoked to have Fabian. Thanks for joining us, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. I'm super excited because I have my own podcast, and at work, I'm usually the one interviewing people. So now the tables have turned a little bit. So I'm like nervous, but like in a good way, you know?
Have you ever personally been featured on another podcast?
Not on a podcast. I've been asked questions and given quotes for like newspaper articles or like magazine articles, but that's just kind of answering very specific questions in a very specific way. So I've never done this really.
I'm super stoked that we get to be your first.
I mean, yeah, I'm super excited as well. I think it's going to be a good chat because we've talked before and yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
So as for those watching on YouTube, you will notice that both of us are in unique background situations. I have a pink wall behind me because I'm at my parents' house for the holidays. And Fabian, why don't you tell everybody where you are and kind of where you also reside and where you've been living also, because I think it's interesting.
Okay, cool. So right at this moment, I'm at my grandma's place in Freiburg, which is in the southwest of Germany, which is why we have these lovely designer limited edition plates behind me and the lovely clock. And yeah, Freiburg is, it's the southwestern corner of Germany and close to France, close to Switzerland, beautiful, like in the mountains, the Black Forest, that kind of stuff, like picture book perfect. But I currently live in Berlin, and I've lived there for almost 7 years now, which is quite a long time. And before that, I lived in New York and studied sports management at NYU there. Before that, I was born in Thailand and lived there for 18 years. So I've kind of lived in 3 different continents and been super privileged in that regard to kind of see different cultures and grow up in a very unique setting, which I think has kind of helped me a little bit as well to get to where I am today.
So I don't know. Maybe we did talk about that. Maybe I just escaped my memory. I didn't know you lived there for 18 years of your childhood. That's what is that experience like? I mean, that's got to be like a completely different culture to grow up in, and then even coming, from there, I guess it'd be the western half of the world. What was like your biggest takeaways, like growing up in childhood and then transitioning to the Western Hemisphere?
I think so. Growing up in Thailand, like I went to an international school, and a lot of my friends were expats or Thais that went to that school, and obviously international private school, a lot of privileged families, children that go there. So it's a great place to grow up, but you do grow up in a bit of a bubble as well. So whilst I was in Thailand and in Bangkok for 18 years, I would say that I never really connected 100% with the locals there. Like, sure, of course, like, I spoke the language and, ate at restaurants, like hung out on the street, did, whatever. But I'm very aware that, as a, privileged foreigner, you do grow up kind of in a bubble, which is weird because then it's my home, but you also feel like an outsider there a little bit.
Sure.
And then, going to Germany in the summers, visiting my grandparents and my family. I'm German, but I felt like an outsider there as well because there were so many different things that like I didn't understand. Like, and this is like a really stupid thing, but on the buses in Germany, there's like a stop sign, right? And it's like you press the button and then the bus stops at the next station. And it was big and red. And I never took the bus in Thailand because that's not something you did, right? We would have like a subway, the SkyTrain, or you take taxis. And I was, as a kid, and this is so weird, but like I was always scared that was like an emergency stop. And like if I pressed it, the bus would just stop on a dime. And those are like, to try and explain it, those are like the little things where you kind of get like a culture shock because it's the most simple things that you don't really understand. And the same was true when I moved to the States then when I was older and was studying there at university. Um, just like so many different like mannerisms, things people did, the way they did things. It was also new and different to me, which was funny.
I'm sure looking back on that now at a later state in life, it's kind of got to be eye-opening or kind of confirming that there's so much more to this world than like kind of these little bubbles that we live in, like you talk about wherever we grew up or where we're from. You know, people do things differently, better or worse, and it kind of gives different perspectives. I'm curious to find out why did you grow up there, right? Was it your parents are from there, or you know,
No,
what's the
so
rationale behind it?
my dad, he left Germany early, like I think he was like 22, 23, and he started working in Asia, in Hong Kong first, for a big German company, and then he moved to Thailand eventually, and started his own company. And he imports goods from Germany, mostly consumer goods like chocolate, Haribo, like all sorts of like shampoos, cheese, meats, whatever, and candies. And he's been there for 30 years, just importing that stuff and selling it to the supermarkets and hotels and restaurants. And my mom, who now lives in Germany again, my dad is still in Thailand.
Wow.
She kind of went on a world tour and like lived in Fiji and Australia, whatever, and ended up in Bangkok where she met my dad. Both of them German, and they kind of got married, had me and my brother, and that's why we lived there because they basically worked there.
Holy cow. That's kind of a wild story.
I guess, yeah. Although, like a lot of people that I grew up with had similar stories, so like you kind of get used to it a little bit. But yeah, I guess outside looking in, it is different.
So now, as you obviously lived there for 18 years, why the decision to study in New York, right? Because I think you went to New
NYU.
York, NYU. Okay, so yeah, why that decision? Did you know that you mentioned sports management, was it that you studied? So why that decision? Obviously, that's something unique. Like you don't think of Thailand as a sports capital or trying to get into that world. So talk about your experience and why you made some of these decisions.
So growing up in Thailand, going to international school, there's really you don't go to university in Thailand unless you want to live and work in Thailand for the rest of your life, right? So a lot of people will go to their home countries. So, for example, if you're, I don't know, a Swedish expat who did high school in Thailand, but you've lived in Sweden before, you might go back to Sweden and study there. The same can be said for Germans, whatever. But a lot of the core kind of kids that grew up there for a long time or for the majority of their lives, like I did, you either go to the US, the UK, or Australia for university. And so again, it comes back to that notion of like identity. And I felt German in Thailand, but I didn't feel German in Germany. And at that point, I would say that I wasn't confident or ready enough to move to Germany because I felt like I would be too, like it would just be too weird of an identity crisis. And so I did kind of what all my friends were doing, and I applied to universities in the States. And in my junior year, or the summer of my junior year, so like going into my senior year, I did like a tour of the US. It was the first time ever that I was in the US. And I looked at, NYU, and then I looked at like UNC Chapel Hill because of Michael Jordan mostly.
Amazing.
Um, Went to Florida, like LA, Minnesota, like literally traveled all over the US and looked at universities. Went to, I think it was like University of Akron or something like that, probably because of LeBron James. I was just like making these random choices. And then I ended up applying to a bunch of them that I liked, and that also had like a good sports management degree because I was always someone who played a lot of sports. And as most kids growing up, I wanted to be a professional football player, soccer player. When that didn't work out, I was like, all right, what's the next best thing? Okay, working in the business. And what do you
Sure.
need? A sports management degree. So that was kind of my thinking. And then I got into NYU, and for me, that was kind of like, okay, like New York's a cool city, NYU is a decent school, so why not?
And you already studied, like you spoke English at this point, right? So the
Yeah, yeah.
transition wasn't okay, cool. And what was your experience like, looking back on it? You studied for 4 years, I'm assuming, in New York City. What was that experience like? Obviously transitioning from a culture like Thailand, although maybe in a bubble, going to New York City, which is what, top 5 largest cities in the world. What is that experience like?
I mean, it was cool. I mean, Bangkok is massive too. I would say that Bangkok unofficially is probably bigger than New York, just with all the, uncounted kind of illegal
Sure.
people there. Um, but it was, I mean, in terms of size and city and stuff, I was pretty used to it. And it helped as well that New York is obviously a grid, right? You've got the avenues, you've got the streets. So it's so much easier to figure your way around. And then like within like a couple weeks, you're like, all right, 42nd and 5th, I know where that is, or like relative to where I am. So that wasn't a problem, but just everything else, like I said, the people, the way people were traveling on the subway, then obviously living alone for the first time in my life, all of that was interesting, like an interesting challenge, which I really really enjoyed. I loved kind of the independence as well that NYU gives you, because not only are you living away from home for the first time, but you're living in a huge city with no real campus, right? When you walk from one building to the next, whether it's from your dorm to class or to the cafeteria or whatever, you're walking through the city, and there's bodegas, there's like, yellow cabs, like honking their horn at you, whatever, like crazy stuff. And so it was cool to just, you didn't feel like a college student in a good way, and sometimes I do think like it would be cool to have gone to a state school somewhere, and had gotten that experience. But at the same time, like I love big cities, I love the city life, and so that was pretty much perfect.
Do you think that like individualism that the city and the kind of structure of NYU provided you made you grow up faster? Or do you think that because you grew up in Thailand or in Bangkok or around like a large city that you already had that experience?
I would say I definitely had that to a certain extent, right? Or in other words, to as much of an extent as maybe a 17, 18-year-old can have. But New York definitely sped things up in that regard. I think you definitely have to be grown up with your money, right? Because it's so expensive if you're eating outside of the dorms. Um, be, mature about, going out. And I know you're not supposed to drink before you're 21 there, but like, like that kind of stuff. And just in general, staying on top of all of your stuff and not getting distracted by all the cool things that the city has to offer. So I think it definitely kind of sped up that process.
And so what eventually happened, right? So you studied for 4 years, you got your degree. What was the next chapter in your progression?
So I initially wanted to stay in the States. I had a girlfriend at the time, who got a job in New York City. But because I was an international student, it was a lot harder for me to get a job, because anyone who was willing to offer me a job based on my portfolio, my CV, wanted me to be able to commit to staying longer than just a year. But as an international student, you only have that 12-month OPT, which means that you can stay in the country for 12 months afterwards and work in your field of study. And so I had, like a tentative job offer from the MLS, and I had like a tentative offer from Adidas, as well as like, I think it was like a 12-month internship or trainee
Sure.
program, working on some of their like collaboration stuff, I think in communications and PR. But they both wanted me to be able to stay in the country for longer than 12 months, which I couldn't guarantee at the time. And so none of this, like none of them like really gave me a concrete offer. And so I went back to Germany for the summer. And as I was in Germany, I was kind of like, all right, well, I'm not going to fly back to the US now with no job, no visa, nothing, and hope for the best, right? Because you can stay there for 3-4 months and try and figure it out. So I just stayed in Germany and started applying to jobs all over Europe, mostly in the big cities, and got my first internship slash job in Berlin at a football app called OneFootball. And that's kind of where the Berlin chapter then started.
It was a football app, you said?
Yeah, so it was like news, statistics, all that
Mm.
kind of like live updates for most of the big European soccer leagues. And I worked in the newsroom there, and I was writing match reports, op-eds, news reports, all that kind of stuff about
But
just like the biggest clubs and the players.
is that what you wanted to do? Like, I feel like sports management's like a really, it's got like a glamorous title to it, but like there's so many different avenues you can go with it, right? Like you can I'm sure you can apply it directly to locker rooms, like in a physical presence. You could apply it to, like you said, newsrooms. Is that the specific niche that you wanted to go in?
So I've always been someone who prefers writing to anything else. I think I express myself the best when I like through written form. Um, Whether it was in middle school, high school, university, I would rather write like a 60-page paper than sit there for an hour or two and answer multiple choice questions, or like do an actual timed exam. Um, and so during my like university career, I blogged as well um, for a little blog called 8x8 Magazine, and
Okay.
they have this like sub blog called The Beautiful Gear, which was basically product focused blog articles about um, footwear style stuff that overlapped with football. So it was kind of like cool football boots that had like that word, I don't know, like for example, designed by Fragment, or like a new football jersey that looked really nice and that you could wear casually. So it was like the beginning of that like overlap that we're seeing more and more now. And so I did that on the side kind of for free, and really enjoyed kind of expressing myself through that form. And when the one football job came around, it kind of was advertised as like working in a newsroom, like writing all day, every day. And I thought, you know what, like initially I wanted to go more into like marketing and kind of campaign management and all that kind of stuff, and more like creative campaigns, like coming up with advertising campaigns for Nike or for like Adidas, whatever. But then when this opportunity came up, I was like, you know what, I actually like writing. I can express myself through writing at this job, and it kind of worked out.
That's awesome. And how long did you stay there before you made another transition? Like, did you enjoy the job? I mean, honestly, it sounds kind of interesting, right? And this was years ago, so it's not like today. I feel like whether it's football in Europe or football in the US, like there's so many different applications, there's so many different news reports and people doing the same thing. But you know, I assume this is like over 5 years ago, and there wasn't as
Yeah.
saturated of a market.
No, it's one of the biggest football apps, at least in Europe. And since I've left, it's just grown like crazy and expanded. It's got around like, I think it's got like over 30 million downloads, um, uh, several million monthly active users. The newsroom has grown from being just German and English to being, they have French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, Russian. So it's a huge, huge operation. And I was there for just under 2 years, and it was great. I mean, as a football fan myself, I was writing about what I loved, sitting in a room with other people who were writing about what they loved, watching as much football as I wanted to watch. Right? We had like 6 TVs set up, and on like a Champions League night or on the weekends, you would come in there and every single game was on, and it was just amazing. And I still have a lot of good friends from that time period, and we were all kind of young and new to the city, and so we grew really close in that regard. Um, and after a while, it was still great, and I loved the job itself, but the working hours were a bit difficult because obviously sports is usually at night, usually on the weekends. So I found that I was usually working when my friends outside of the company were not, and the other way around, that they were working when I was free. And so social life was kind of like, building up a social life was a little bit difficult. And so around, yeah, a year and 10 months into the job, I made the decision to find something new, and that ended up being HighSnobiety, which is where I've been now for 4 years and 4 months now, which is also a very, very long time.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is a long stint. That's kind of interesting that and I'm assuming you were still fairly young at that point. So, I mean, you are still young right now, but making that very self-aware decision to be like, hey, listen, like I like my job, but I have no life. I need to do something about this. And that, like, prioritizing yourself in that fashion, I feel like people don't do nearly as much as they probably should,
Mhm.
because the job's good and they don't, want to disappoint either themselves or somebody else. But it sounds like you were wildly self-aware, to make that transition. And it's not to say that HighSnobiety isn't a good, better, or worse job. It's just, you know,
Yeah, I think it really depends as well on like what your priorities are, right? Like you just said, and what what your goals are at that specific phase or time in your life. And yeah, I was relatively young at the time, um, but I did find that after 2 years of like great fun and everything, I was missing the social aspect of my life, my private life, a little bit too much. And so I basically just looked for a job that was still in Berlin where I could still write, but didn't have to work on weekends. And, you know, through friends, I was connected with someone at HighSnobiety who worked in the HR department and, you know, applied, went through a couple of interview rounds, some sample writing, um, and eventually got the job as a staff writer at HighSnob. And when that happened, it was kind of like my life didn't change, but like obviously like a lot more time opened up on the weekends. I saw a lot of people more than I had in a very long time, which was really cool. And also at work, the focus kind of shifted towards more, you know, our culture, right? Like footwear, style, music, uh, culture in general, which was cool because then I learned so much. And I think that's kind of underrated as well when you kind of pivot and switch industries. It, as long as you can do the actual parts of your job, right? As long as I'm a writer, as long as I can write, you can learn all the other stuff. And at the beginning, you soak it up like a sponge, right? Like when I worked at One Football, friends would be asking me like, "Oh, who's this player?" Or like, "Is he good?" And I would know everything about everyone. 3 months into my job at HighSnobiety, I forgot most of the football stuff because I wasn't keeping up with the news. But if they asked me when's this shoe coming out or whose music video is this or whatever, I knew everything because you just engage with it every day. So I guess that's like one thing that I'd say as well to listeners, that pivoting between industries is a lot easier than you think, as long as you have those like transferable skills that actually help you do the actual job, right? And the rest you can learn, the subject matter.
that's a wildly interesting point. I once listened to this podcast about this woman who, every 10 years of her career, she would shift and completely transition her skill sets and those kind of core competencies to a brand new field. And then after her entire lifetime, she was like the most well-rounded, you know, kind of most relatable person to whatever company that she inquired within, because she had all this vast kind of skills in different departments. And it sounds like you're kind of building that slowly. Um, I'm curious to find out though, did you know about HighSnob before you applied to the job? You obviously, that's one of the most world renowned, I'll call, kind of hype or culture driven in the sneaker fashion markets magazines that in my opinion that people click on every single day, right? They're like addicts, like me,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that, I am one of them. um was was the transition hard, or did you have you always been like a sneakerhead? Have you always been like into fashion? Like, I'm assuming if you can have the core skills like you talk about, but you also need like another gear to be successful, which I think that's partially why the reason why we're sitting here talking is that you have been successful in your writing career there. So you have to be engaging in the culture and understanding. Did you always have that, or you just brought it up to another level because you're good at your job?
I was always into sneakers, and I read High Snobiety long before I joined the team. So it was one of the outlets that, you know, I used to keep up to date with sneaker news and, you know, like where are these Yeezys dropping, like what raffles can I sign up to back in the early good old days. So I would say that like my two kind of big passions are football and, you know, footwear. Um, and then food, but that's like maybe in 10 years I'll be writing about food. uh, but no, I've always been into it, and I think obviously that helps, right? Like when I said before that you can always learn everything, like you can to a certain extent, but obviously having that base knowledge and the passion for something does take you to the next level. And I think to your point about the podcast, and the woman that changed jobs or industries every 10 years, you do bring a fresh kind of perspective to your job, right? If you've been working in the automotive industry, for example, and then you move to fashion or vice versa, you can bring the best of those industries and apply them to whatever project is you're working on. And that's why we see so many of these creatives nowadays, you know, such as obviously the late Virgil Abloh and everyone else, Daniel Arsham, all those guys. They have a passion for all of these different things, these different, you know, whether it's cars, Pokemon, footwear, sneakers, fashion, and they just apply their lens to it kind of, and they learn things from each project and carry that with them. And I think that just shows that really the core skills are the most important thing, and then everything else around that kind of comes with, you know, passion, drive, energy.
So as when you got hired as a, I think you said a staff writer or staff editor, were you placed in a creative bubble, or were you creatively allowed to put you, like you talk about, put your lens on different aspects of fashion, of sneakers, or were you specific to one avenue, and then you showcased your skill set, and then you were given other opportunities? Because I think right now you're writing kind of a breadth among sneakers, lifestyle, sportswear, a bunch of topics. So kind of talk about your 4-year career there thus far, and kind of some of the different things that you've been able to do.
So to begin with, I would say that like a staff writer kind of writes about everything, right? So you're, you know, the lowest on the totem pole, but not in a bad way. You kind of pump out the news, and with your senior editor or your boss, you kind of decide what's cool, what's not, and what's worth writing about. And in the beginning, like the first, you know, 6 to 12 months, I was writing about music, I was writing about fashion, I was writing about design, architecture, footwear, and just kind of dipping my toes into kind of all of the little pools that HighSnobiety covers. And it was clear very early and very quickly that, you know, my passion and personal knowledge of footwear, or prior knowledge of footwear and sneakers, made me better at that than I was at writing about any of the other stuff. But I think it definitely helped me kind of broaden my knowledge of the entire culture and like what HighSnobiety is all about by writing about these things and figuring out, okay, like this watch, like why is it cool, or why is it special, or Bape, you know, the history of Bape and all that kind of stuff. And so I would say that to begin with, you are given somewhat free reign to apply your own kind of spin and style to the news, but you are in a bubble where they kind of shepherd you towards like, okay, we should be writing about this. And obviously like news has to be written straight up. But like a good example would be, I came from football, and anytime we wrote about a football player, for example, I was the one writing about it because I had that prior knowledge. And there you can then bring in, like, you know, if I'm writing about Cristiano Ronaldo, for example, and he just played really well on the weekend, but this piece is about his terrible style, or like he wore the skinniest skinny jeans or whatever. You can bring that into it. Like someone who's not knowledgeable about football would just write like, oh, Cristiano Ronaldo, the famous football player, wore this and that. Well, I would write Cristiano Ronaldo, hot off of scoring 2 goals on the weekend against blah, blah, blah. And so you bring in, even if it's just like a tiny bit of knowledge that you drop in there, it does make a difference. And that's why I think it's so important to kind of have a broad knowledge of all of these subject matters, even within the niche that is HighSnobiety.
That's awesome to hear. As you were speaking, I was thinking about it, and I'm so glad we transitioned into this. You know, I like to have conversations, and I think it brings a tremendous amount of value where, you know, obviously my background's in footwear and product design, but writing is a creative field, right? You are a creative, you are an artist in your own sense. What are some of like the biggest attributes, you know, of you as a creative or you as a writer that you need to bring? You know, you just hinted at it, right? Like you need to, you know, level up these details to really engage into the reader's eyes, or, you know, captivate them. What are some of the other like core things that you think you do really well? I'm curious as to that. And then also like what's like, in your perspective, the biggest thing that writers struggle with, and where they can improve?
Oh, those are two difficult questions.
Let's start
I
with
would
the first one.
Okay. I would say that it really depends. Like there's technical aspects of writing, right? So, for example, news. you want to tell the reader exactly what you're writing about in the first two sentences. So if you're writing about, I don't know, Teddy Santis leaked a new Aim Leon Dore New Balance collaboration on his Instagram, right? Or teased it. You basically, what I just said, you will write in the first two sentences. And that basically already covers the entire story. And then you go into more detail. And then you give them context. Okay, who is Teddy Santis? Why is an Aim Leon Dore New Balance collaboration so significant or important? Were there previous collaborations? How were they perceived? And that's kind of where the meat of the writing is. But the actual pertinent information is in the first two lines. So in a technical sense, there's a lot of these little tips and tricks that are good to know. But I would say that also what's really important to be a good writer is to read a lot. So what I would always tell like aspiring writers or writers who want to make it in the industry or whatever is, if you all you're doing is writing and all you're doing is surrounding yourself with your opinion, your viewpoint, your thoughts, your words, then sure, if you're a good writer, then that's okay, but you're never really going to broaden your skill set or your POV, right? But if you're reading, for example, I spend a lot of time reading Complex, reading Hypebeast, reading Sneaker Freaker, reading Vogue, whatever, because I know that there's some really, really talented writers out there. And even if it's like just, okay, like reaffirming what I was thinking. So I'm thinking, you know, like Asics, Kiko Kostadinov is a great collaboration, and bringing him in-house was a great move. If I see that Complex and GQ are writing about that, I'm like, okay, yeah, like that reaffirms what I was thinking. Or you're reading something and this writer is has like amazing diction and is using these great long words, and like that makes his writing super interesting. If you learn one or two of those words and then incorporate them into your own writing, that already elevates you as a writer. So there's so many things that you can kind of pick from other people, not in the sense that you're stealing from them, but rather that you're learning through reading their writing and improving yourself as a writer. Because I'd say there's two ways to improve writing. One is just to keep writing, obviously, and the other is to read what other people are saying, how other people are writing, what their viewpoints are, what the kind of general consensus is in the industry, and then using that to kind of shape your own opinion and your own output.
Wouldn't that also kind of inform you on the second question, right? Like what you don't like, you know, what your creative flavor is or your lens. You know, if you're seeing what other writers in here are just like, man, I really wouldn't have worded it that way. And so you can
Yeah,
figure out where the opportunity for improvement is, and what you kind of think, you know, what the future is going to look like of writing, or how to really spin something to captivate somebody.
exactly. Right. Whether it's wording or a specific subject matter that they chose to write about, where you're like, okay, like maybe I wouldn't have written it like that or written about that at all. So I think, right, you learn the good things, but you also learn the things that might not be as good, because I'll be the first to admit, like I make mistakes in my writing sometimes. Some sentences are, you know, hard to understand or too long, run-on sentences, whatever. And all other writers out there, nobody's perfect, right? So I'm sure that people are reading my writing, and there's some stuff that they really like, and then there's some stuff where they're like, okay, he could have written this a lot better, or I could have written it better than Fabian. And it's the same with me when I read something and I'm like, okay, the introduction wasn't that great, but the conclusion was absolutely perfect. How would I have done it? Then that's an exercise in and of itself, right? Where you're kind of like approaching almost like a problem and seeing like, okay, like how do you fix this, or how would I fix it if I was writing this piece?
That's, you know, I love this conversation because we do focus. I've had, you know, conversations similar with a lot of creatives of like, you know, don't focus on what other people are doing. You know, it'll absorb you. You're going to compare yourself. But you seem to have a very, you know, optimistic and then also like educational way about that, of like, let's use this to inform myself for the good and the bad, versus it as a competition, which so many people can go down that rabbit hole in the vortex of like, and get stuck there, and then they'll become stagnant.
Yeah,
So I think the way that you phrase it and the way that it works in your mind is really important, and hopefully people gain a lot out of that, because I see there's a lot of importance in that. even in other creative fields, right? Like I think that's, for myself, that's why you could do footwear design, but then also being an artist part-time, and injecting yourself into other creative things, whether that's reading books and informing yourself in a new way. It also like elevates you and provides that different perspective or narrative towards your full-time job per se.
Yeah. No, I would say like, of course there's competition, right? Like I'll use Complex because I'd say that they're one of the better publications out there that are not called HighSnobiety, right? So um uh obviously there's, stories that you're competing for, whether that's an exclusive interview with someone or to break news, to be first. Obviously there's competition. But I know that if they write a certain piece and I write a certain piece that might be similar or about the same subject matter or topic, people are a lot of people in our community that read on the daily are probably going to read both. Or just because Complex wrote something doesn't mean that we can't write it, or just because they wrote something and people read theirs, people won't read ours. So I see it less as like a fierce competition where you have to one up each other every single time, and just there's enough bread for everyone to go around. There's there's enough places at the table. The community, the industry is so big that one or two articles that they write or one or two articles that I write aren't going to really tip the balance in either way, you know?
That's I love that perspective. I have this is just a fun question. What do you think is the best thing that you've been able to accomplish at High Snob? Like whether that was an event that you went to, or an article that you wrote, or a trip you went on that informed an article that you wrote. Kind of what's like a main highlight for you from your experience thus far?
Oh man, there's been so many. Um, I would say that I think through my work at HighSnobiety, like there's been so many amazing, articles and interviews that I've done at HighSnobiety that would definitely like to make a top 10 would be impossible. But I think my work at HighSnobiety allowed me to write a book for Adidas. Like it was one of their like promotional materials. It was for I don't know if you remember this release. It was the Night Jogger. Do you remember that?
I don't. What year was it?
So it was 2018, I think.
Okay, so yeah, a
2018,
little while ago.
2018. 2018 or 2019, but it was one of their like classic OG running shoes that was one of the first running shoes to have reflective material. I think it was back in the 80s. And they brought that shoe back as like a lifestyle version, similar to kind of how the Oswego was brought back. But this one was called the Night Jogger. And to launch that silo or that silhouette, Adidas wanted to come up with a campaign. And what they came up with was that, a lot of creatives, like you said, that have side hustles or that, explore other creative outlets, don't do that during the day because obviously they've got their day jobs. So they'll be doing that on the weekends or at night. And that's where the Night Jogger came in, where these creatives who are awake and working at night wear the Night Jogger because they want to be seen at night, kind of. That was the thinking. And so they created a couple of like promotional materials, one of which was like an energy drink that was branded. Then another one was like a teddy bear that, you would take to sleep. But this teddy bear, every time you touched it or pressed it, it would like yell out motivational like slogans like, oh, like
That's kind of
stay up or
cool.
like don't sleep. And it was supposed to keep you awake. And the same was done with a children's book. And the children's book was supposed to be like a book that keeps adults awake in a way. So, but it was just like formatted as a children's book. And I was asked to write that book with a good friend of mine, Dan Freebairn of Kick Posters. He did the illustration, and he was actually the one who brought me on for the project. They told him like, hey, listen, we want to do a book. We want you to illustrate it, and you can choose who writes it. And I had a very good relationship with him through HighSnobiety. We used a lot of his illustrations on our pieces, and I think that's kind of where it came from. He appreciated my writing and just appreciated kind of the relationship, the professional relationship we had built up. And so that's like one thing that I'm super proud of, that like, I was able to connect with someone in a way that he was like, hey, yo, you'd be cool for this project. And B, I actually wrote a book, even if it's an adult's children book, it was pretty cool.
That's an awesome story, man. I love that, and I think That's one thing that I continually strive for, even transitioning now into the new year, of like continually just building good relationships. And I truly, I've said this now a couple times, like amongst friends, but like working with your friends is the best type of work, right? It comes naturally, it's authentic, it's real, and it really brings out the best creative or writing or whatever it is, because you're comfortable, right? And you elevate one another. And so I love hearing that. As we were chatting a little bit offline, and I have a few more questions for you, and then we'll wrap it up because we've been chatting now for a minute, which has been fantastic. Um, as you transition into the new year, we were chatting a little bit offline that you are going to be pursuing a new venture, and I kind of wanted to give you the opportunity to share as much or as little as you want to in regards to that.
So yeah, so after almost 4.5 years now, I've made the decision to move on from HighSnobiety, which was a very, very difficult situation, not situation, decision. I love my job, like I told you, and one of my favorite things about my job is meeting new people through interviews, through, like at events, through PR. I mean, that's how we kind of met as well, over
Yeah.
Instagram. And then I was like, hey, like you'd be great for a piece that I'm writing for the magazine. And then you were like, okay, cool. Like, do you want to be on my podcast? And that's like the coolest, for me, that's like the coolest kind of interaction that you can have. And that's only made possible through the platform that HighSnobiety has given me. So I'm like forever grateful to, David Fisher and the whole team for, letting me add my voice to HighSnobiety's voice, to say. But yeah, starting in February, I'll be working, I'll be doing creative strategy for a big e-commerce platform in Germany, which will entail that, I'm doing or working on the strategy for how to present products online, and whether that's, how to shoot campaign imagery, how to shoot product imagery, whether, we incorporate video or 3D digital kind of renderings onto the websites, what kind of models we use, all that kind of stuff, which is a pivot away from writing for sure, which is exciting and scary at the same time, because writing is all I've done for the past like 7 years. But I'm definitely super excited. It's a good chance to try something new and add some more skills kind of to my portfolio, which will then hopefully carry me further, like 5 to 10 years from now.
But what's really amazing about that, and this is the first time he's shared with me what he's actually doing, so this is just off the top of my brain at this point. You've come full circle. After college, you thought you would be doing more campaign direction, more advertising kind of, and then after these experiences, you're now transitioning, it seems like, back to that root of like, hey, that was a love that I was trying to go after, but I shifted away from it. It's kind of awesome to see that you're going inching back towards that and just to test that field.
I haven't even thought of it like that, but yeah, you're right. Like, I guess so. Like it's less hands-on, because writing is a very hands-on kind of type of work, right? And this is more sitting back, project management, creative thinking, strategy, ideation, which is what I wanted to do all along. So yeah, now that you put it like that, it's gotten me even more excited, and I was already excited for the job. So
Yeah, I'm super stoked. I'm sure that your journey over the next however long you decide to stay within that is going to be amazing. I have two more questions for you. Speaking of that journey, how can people find you? Where do people, follow along your work, your journey as you transition into this new phase? Social media and or a website if you have one.
yeah, so my Instagram is MaiSaiPak, which is MIASIAPAK, which means no veggies, please, in Thai. Um,
I didn't know that.
that's what it means. Yeah, so it's like a running joke I have with my friends, where um, when we went to order food, or like we were at a restaurant, you can always order a dish without vegetables, and that's my side pack. And my brother would always want dishes without vegetables, and I would want them with vegetables. And so that was because in Thailand, or in Asian culture generally, you order to share, right? So we would be arguing about whether the shared dish should have vegetables or not. And I just thought it had such a nice ring to it. So that ended up becoming my Instagram handle a while back. So yeah, people can follow me there. And then I also have my own podcast with a friend of mine, Josh, where we just talk about, you know, diverse sneaker topics and all sorts of things, upcoming releases. And that's called the Kickback Sneaker Podcast, which is also on Instagram at kickback.pod. So I'll be posting a lot on those two accounts. The latter, obviously, more about the podcast, and the former, you know, my work, and I do have some side projects that I'm working on. Nothing that I can reveal just yet, but it'll be stuff that keeps me more in the niche of like streetwear and sneakers. So I'm very excited about that as well.
That's amazing to hear. I'm super stoked, and definitely folks. And we didn't even get a chance to talk about your experience as a podcast host, because it is unique. I've had a couple other people who have been podcast hosts, but definitely give that a listen. Follow along. I love the story behind the name. My Sai Pak. Am I saying that correct? Amazing.
Yeah. So my is no, Sai is put, and Pak is veggies. So no
Amazing.
Put veggies.
I learned Taiwanese today, so that's
Thai,
awesome.
Thai,
or Thai. It's just Thai. Okay,
Thai. Yeah.
I'm learning a lot of things today. And then my last question for you, Fabian, is if you had one message to give anybody else in the world, based on your experiences thus far in life, what would you tell somebody? Whether that's motivational, whether that's about writing, whether that's, you know, it could be anything. What's one thing that, or one message that you would give the world if you had to share one thing?
And this is gonna be pretty cheesy, but I'm just gonna steal the slogan from a brand that we all like, and just do it. You know, like if you have thoughts about starting a podcast or starting a blog, setting up your own website, learning a new skill, whether that's Photoshop or video editing, just do it. There's no time like now. I think, you know, Virgil said the same as well. Like, just go out and try it, because you're not going to know if it's for you unless you try it. And there's been so many moments in my life where, you know, I look back and there were ideas that I had, things I wanted to do. And then I was kind of like, nah, I'm too lazy, or like, you know, like the first hurdle was too high, or I had other things on my mind, whether it was personal or job related, and then I didn't do them. And the things I'm most proud of are things that I just went out and did, like the podcasts, like writing about sneakers, and all sorts of stuff. So anyone listening to this, watching this, or whatever, literally just go out and do it.
That's amazing advice, and very fitting for our subject matter of
Exactly.
culture. Fabian, thank you very much for being our guest on this week's either 54 or 55, we'll decide, of an Untold narrative. This has been a fantastic interview. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate it. I really obviously appreciate the chance to share my story, but also just, you know, having a chat with you. It's been super, super relaxed, and yeah, thanks, man.